Thank you for joining us for the Safe Passage Annual Fall Fundraiser. I'm David Foster, Chair of the Board of Directors for Safe Passage, and I welcome you all to this event. A special thank you to the table hosts who invited you here today, our speaker, Mai Kao Hang, to elected officials in attendance, Minnesota State Representatives Jay Zong and Dave Pinto, and County Commissioners Jim McDonough and Victoria Reinhardt, and to Stephanie McCorkle and 9 North for organizing and hosting this event. The agenda for the day is that we'll have a video and then turn the call over to Executive Director Rich Gehrman, who will introduce our speaker, show an additional video, and make comments before turning the call back to me to explain the various ways you are able to support Safe Passage. Before we go to the first video, a few words about Rich Gehrman. 12 years ago, Rich could have retired and headed to the lake in a leisurely life. Instead, he started Safe Passage and has worked as one of Minnesota's most tireless child advocates, doing all he can to protect the most vulnerable children. Rich produces a weekly Safe Passage blog and podcast, which is available wherever you download your favorite podcasts. And earlier this year, Rich was recognized by CASA, the largest guardian ad litem organization in the state, with the Mark Proctor Hero for Children Award. Why has Rich done all this? Part of the reason is because of what you'll see in this video.
Well, first, let me just say thank you to all of you for watching this video, because I know it's a difficult one, but it's important to hear these children's stories. And also a special thanks to our volunteer coordinator and volunteer manager, Stephanie McCorkle, for conceiving and producing this video. And I had planned to use this video as a segue to introduce our first speaker, Jeffrey Montpettit, who's an award-winning attorney with the Sieben Carey Law Firm. But he just let us know this morning that his father has passed away. So we send our sincere condolences to Jeff and his family. And as many of you know, we do a webinar every other Wednesday afternoon, and we will try to line up Jeff to speak at one of these webinars in the next month or so. So please watch for an announcement about that. And I'll just tell you a little bit about what Jeff was going to say. We invited him to speak because he's one of a small number of Minnesota lawyers who have expertise in child welfare. Jeff and his colleague, Jeff Storms, obtained recently a $1.5 million settlement on behalf of the grandmother of Kendrea Johnson, whom many of you may recall was a 6-year-old girl who committed suicide in 2014 because of inaction by the county and the foster care agency. And I understood Jeff was going to talk about litigation they're currently pursuing on behalf of the grandparents of a little girl named Ariana Hunziker, who was 3 years old and was moved from her grandparents to foster care because they were considered too old to care for her, and placed in a foster home. So Ariana died a particularly terrible death, despite many of the red flags that were known about her situation, known to her social worker and doctor and nurse practitioner. And as Jeff has been tutoring me, Ariana Hunziker's death helps to illustrate the difficulty of seeking legal redress for children while they are in child protection. A Supreme Court decision has given states and counties, much as with the police, virtual immunity from legal consequences for children until they go into foster care. And even then, it's very difficult to secure justice for them. So I plan to follow up on Jeff's remarks by saying that, this inability to hold public agencies legally accountable for children is why political activism is one of the few tools available to make changes. And I want to just ask all of you to please talk about the concerns that we're raising today with your friends, your family, your colleagues. Let's just please talk this issue up and help us raise it once again to one of the top public policy priorities. And again, of course, please join us if you can at the Capitol in the upcoming session and visiting with your elected officials about child welfare issues. So every year, we try to include some remarks by individuals who have been directly involved with child protection and foster care. And this year, we're sharing highlights from a panel discussion that we hosted a few months ago on one of our webinars, featuring 3 current and former foster and adoptive parents. So our panelists are first Becky Gawboy, who was licensed to care specifically for Indian children as an Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, foster parent. She fostered 90 Native American children from 15 Minnesota counties for 10 years before she and her husband adopted 12 of them. And then in 33 years, Jean Gleason has fostered more than 100 children from Hennepin and Washington counties. And then in just her first 4 years as a foster parent, Crystal Layton has fostered 29 children from Stearns, Kenny, Ojai, and 4 other counties. So here are our panelists and the questions we asked them, starting with, why did they decide to become foster parents?
We watched a case on the news of a little girl who said she didn't want to go back with her dad because she was being abused, but she was basically forced to go back there because they weren't really listening to her. He was working his case plan, so he had the right to have them back, and she had no voice.
Somehow I just always knew I'd do foster, and I don't really know why I wasn't exposed to anything related to foster care.
We had friends who were losing their children to care, and they wanted us to take their 10-year-old, and we weren't licensed. So we talked it over, and we decided to get licensed with Fond du Lac.
Seeing some of the kids coming in and what maltreatment can do, and really seeing how far behind they are and things, that's really sad for us when they first come. The joys on the flip side are watching these kids thrive when they come into a different environment, seeing them learn to do things that they couldn't do before, how short of a time in 1 week, how much kids can change and be a total different kid. Watching the joy on their faces as they get to do something that they've never gotten to do before, or learning something and becoming a whole new kid.
The joys were in just watching, like Crystal said, the kids to thrive and to open their world a little bit, to see more that's available.
We lived on a farm, and it was wonderful to watch kids' eyes open. It was incredible. We loved that part of it. And we also, took our kids to powwows, and we did ceremonies, and a lot of kids had not had any experience with that. We had kids that we even hear a really short time that said that it made a difference in their life being with us.
There's a huge push to get kids back with bios, which we understand, but sometimes it's very much at the cost of the children. Oftentimes we see that it's the social workers that do that work. It looks like on paper, like the parents are doing okay, and then they say, okay, send the kids home. And often we see kids struggle a lot once home. In those times we do get to see the kids afterwards, we see huge regression back again. It's really heartbreaking to watch.
I agree with Crystal in that sometimes the plan is set in place, but they're not following it. I had an example of an infant who came very malnourished. Finally got him all plumped up and comfortable and so forth, and well, because he was quite sick at the time too when I got him. And then, but the mother was desperate to have him back by her birthday. In the meantime, she hadn't been showing up to, learn how to feed him, because she didn't like that he had some reflux, so she didn't feed him very much because she didn't want him to throw up. But because it was her birthday, and she was begging the social worker agreed and placed the baby home. Well, needless to say, I got him back quite scrawny again, extremely sick.
What really troubled me is that when kids did get to go back home with their parents, and it was all planned and things were good, they sent kids back to parents who didn't have the financial resources to care for them. We had one father who was doing fantastically, but he was given 3 days notice to get his kids back. He'd been out of prison for a month, had gotten a job, found an apartment, but still didn't have the resources to furnish it. And they gave him 3 days to get his kids out, otherwise they were going to go forward with the termination. And so we told him, don't worry, I gave him resources in the town he lived in to get furniture, and we sent him back with a whole household full of stuff. Because of the boarding school issue, many of these parents never were parented because their parents didn't have a model for parenting. My husband's father and brother were put into boarding schools at age 8, and they stayed there until they were 18. And so they were parented until they were 8. And so he was a really good dad to his kids until he was 8, and then he just checked out. But that was a fact. That's a fact of life for a lot of Indian families, is they don't have that training. We had, at the time we were foster parents, there were occasionally doing whole family placements where the parents and the kids came to a foster home, and learned how to parent kind of, right there in situ. And that is a really successful model that is not done at all anymore. And that's tragic, because that's how you find out if they have those skills or if they're able to get those skills.
Well, I just want to thank our 3 foster parents for doing that panel. And you can see the entire panel if you would like on our website. It was really energizing and interesting. So I invite you to look for it there. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Mike Hao Hong, who has become the first founding dean of the Morrison Family College of Health in the fall of 2019. And that was after serving for 10 years as the president and CEO of the Wilder Foundation, which is, as many of you know, one of Minnesota's largest nonprofit human services providers. I first met Mike Hao when we served together on the Governor's Task Force on the Protection of Children in 2015, and I was immediately impressed by her ability to make everyone around her feel comfortable and included. She's just a very gracious individual, and those are great qualities for one of our most important leaders in the community. The University of St. Thomas has recently formed the Morrison Family College of Health, which has within it the School of Social Work, a graduate school of professional psychology, undergraduate majors in health sciences, and, coming soon, a School of Nursing. Mike Hao will speak about the new college and how some of her own experiences have helped her inform its vision and its strategic direction. Dr. Hong?
Thank you, Rich. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me here to speak. It's really an honor to be here with an audience that cares about our vulnerable children in society and preventing the maltreatment of our smallest human beings who don't have a voice in public policy. The vision of the Morrison College is to educate our next generation of health professionals, including social workers, to work in service to the whole person. And that would be physically, mentally, socially, and spiritually, in a community-engaged way that can dismantle health inequities. The Morrison Family College of Health is about expanding and going upstream with prevention and early intervention to create and promote better health and well-being for all people, regardless of background, and moving us away from intervention-based sick care to whole person care. I'm really excited about our vision because our hope lies in our young people to build a better future. So I thought I would talk about how when I started my career, it was actually working in a group home for adults with disabilities in the city of St. Paul. After my first day as a personal care attendant, I went home, I cried, and I threw up. That day, I had learned how to do a proper restraint, help these adults brush their teeth, and assist with toileting. On that mile-long walk home, as it reflected on my first day, I was already really upset about what I had seen and done. My 18-year-old self was just not mentally strong enough to be a personal care attendant, or so I thought. So I called my supervisor, who was a licensed social worker, and I told her I wanted to quit. She convinced me to try it for just one more day, and still, for some unknown reason to me, I decided I would just try it again. I went back again and again, day after day, and that summer I fell in love with the residents and the work that I did there. So many years later, my work with those nurses, social workers, and other direct care staff, alongside the many, many others that I've worked with now, have continued to stick with me. From working on facilitating domestic abuse groups for children and families, to working with teenagers who are at risk in gang-ridden neighborhoods, to working at Ramsey County Human Services as a director, and then sitting on mortality reviews for children who had died, I could see the breakdowns in our child welfare system. And I found that my purpose was really about people and the systems change that could happen to work in favor of the most vulnerable people in society, including children. So one of the things that no one ever tells you when you come into a leadership role is that when you start handling and problem solving, they're usually around the most difficult and complex issues facing society. And I felt ill-equipped. While in college and later in my career, I reflected repeatedly on this first day at the group home. I realized that I was actually most impacted by the stories of these adults and actually their life stories as children. Case files, for those of you who don't know, really tell the story of a life through official documents. with written comments and reports from social workers, nurses, doctors, and other helping professionals. The system, as we call it, in written record. What I learned that summer and through the years of both doing direct services and social work myself and working on policies to help protect and support the most vulnerable children and adults is that the dignity and value of one life can't be quantified in numbers. And that even though research may look sound, seem sound, it can still be discriminatory and biased, especially if those framing the questions and our policies, the research that engaged in it, have a certain worldview or mindset. How else can we explain the centuries of research that reinforce racism, a hierarchy of human value that still plagues our child welfare system, to have so many disparities because of intergenerational harm and trauma and because of poverty and so many other things? In my view, if we're truly going to dismantle racism and poverty to improve health outcomes, and that would be also the community, the well-being of the whole community, we have to lead with cultural competency and responsiveness. Cultural competency is a skill that actually can be taught. And until we do this, the path to equity is going to be difficult because we're going to keep perpetuating the status quo, which is already generating racial and income-based disparities, especially those that we see in the child welfare system. So because the Morrison Family College of Health is a college that is being founded to address root causes and to go upstream, I've decided we're going to do a few things differently. First, we're going to start with the faculty and the staff in the Morrison Family College of Health to build our cultural competency skills, and then we're going to teach the students how to do this, because we can have no path to equitable outcomes or serving children or keeping them safe if we can't see them for the beautiful human beings that they are and that they can be, regardless of race. Second, we can't be buying into the narrative that diversity is what divides us as a country, instead of uniting us as part of one human family. Children are born faultless and blameless. It's us, the adults. Think about it. We're a country of displaced people on stolen lands. The only times we've made progress on anything has been when we've come together across our social and economic divisions so that we can do what is important. And we need to do this for our future and for our children. At St. Thomas, it's also really special in the College of Health because I'm proud that the School of Social Work is a part of it. In all the work that I've done in the community, I've worked with both people and employees who are trained as social workers or people like me doing social work but trained in a different field. And I can really tell when someone has a social work degree because they're just simply equipped with more knowledge before they hit the ground running to serve the community. In this particular situation, to serve vulnerable kids. They understand and can leverage the differences in all the different levels of change, individual, organizational, community, and systems levels. Too often in my career, I've seen the weakness of those not trained to see the resilience of children, to understand developmentally where they are, and those who are completely unable to assess when a child is at risk. It took a long time for me to learn how to be skilled in seeing what our littlest people need, our babies, our infants, our young children, so that they can just have what they need to survive and then thrive and to simply exist in the world. What are those things that children need to exist, to thrive and live and survive? Well, I'd say it's basic needs, but before this, safety. Some people think about basic needs as food, water, shelter, and yes, for those more enlightened, social and emotional well-being, and I would say good spiritual health. But when I think about children, I always think about safety, and then social and emotional well-being, and then all the other things, including food, water, and shelter. The truth is that there are open secrets in our child welfare system that show up in the papers sometimes, or in the murders of children. Things that perhaps we knew how to fix, but may not have the will to do so. One of these times, it led to the creation of the Child Protection Task Force, and this is how I met Rich Gehrman. Advocates for children, such as those with safe passages, have a really important role to fill in society, and that is to represent the voices of the vulnerable, and I would say the most vulnerable. Our babies, our toddlers, the people who can't fend for themselves. I'd say that public policy is a blunt instrument, and to sharpen it, we need to remember who and what we're here for, and that is the children of our community. We can all stand by and be silent, but it's our jobs to be civically engaged. And every day I've worked to support the safety of children, and I've also worked to support the resilience in children. I have to always remember at times like this that there are a lot of positive forces for good, and that there are many negative forces that also exploit and harm children. Sometimes those negative forces are inside what should be the safest place, which is inside of their own families. Or perhaps, if we've seen through the panel, perhaps it's with other people who we think are safe. Our School of Social Work is dedicated to generating practitioners and scholars who advocate for systems change to advance health equity and social justice, which means that though we graduate excellent clinicians and social workers, we also aim to teach our students to do more, and that would be not only to serve, but to advance the common good and to bend the arc towards social justice. Because one of the things I also remember from my service in the group home, after reading all those cases that very first time, is that learning that many of these adults with disabilities who live there also had traumatic brain injuries and were neglected and abused by children, oftentimes by their parents. Perhaps some of them were born with disabilities, but I'm sure, a lot of it was also because of abuse and trauma. Too long ago to tell. In my almost 3 months of working there, there was not one guest or visitor for these individuals who came to see them. This pattern would be repeated over my lifetime of service to others in the community. Without fail, there was maltreatment, abuse, neglect, and trauma among those who are most vulnerable. I don't know what it is about the heart of humanity that always calls out to me to do more, to be more, and to cherish these beautiful, precious lives. I just know we can do better and that we must do better. Though we love our children in Minnesota, we're also one of the states that invest the least in them by way of building opportunities and investing in them. Children are resilient and they're our future. And today, because I've become someone who can influence policy, and as Toni Morrison writes, I come as one but stand as 10,000. Think about that. That's what we're teaching in the Morrison Family College of Health, because if we can teach one social worker well, we can have them stand as 10,000, and then perhaps we could change the world. If an originally poor, disenfranchised refugee kid like me, who grew up with parents who struggled with trauma from the war, could grow up resilient, I believe other children can as well if we offer them the right support and interventions and safety. I still remember when I had no bed to sleep in and no chair to sit on. It was a social worker from the Public Housing Agency who got some furniture there. I was only 6 years old at the time. Our children are not doing as well as we'd like them to, but I know we can do more. For instance, half the people on the streets in Minnesota are under the age of 18 with no place to call home. The streets are not a safe place for children. Parents who are struggling with poverty have a long way to go to help their kids. I decided a long time ago that we can't let birth and circumstance decide the destiny of our collective children. Good things can happen when we work together, and it is that faith in collectivism and not going with the status quo that motivates me each day not to give up on systems change, to question the authorities that we should trust. Now I build on this passion and vision to be the founding dean of the Morrison Family College of Health. And I built on that when I was the president of the Wilder Foundation and in all other roles that I've had. Some people may think it might be my own personal suffering as a forgotten person in society and as an invisible minority that's fueled me to advance the common good. But this would be false thinking on their parts. The truth is, I never once told my story personally, my personal story, until I had become the first person of color, woman, and former refugee to become the president of the Wilder Foundation. In short, I had already arrived in the top role. Now, as a dean, I'm just paying it forward to the next generation, to educate as many students as I can to not only serve and provide hope, healing, and opportunity for those who are most disadvantaged, but to also use their social ingenuity to advance change. Our passion for justice, service, and social change means we would love to have students with a change the world mindset come to St. Thomas. Through them, I know we will do well. Thank you again for having me here to speak. If you'd like to learn more, please go to our website, health.stthomas.edu, for information.
Thank you, Dean Hong, for your work and that of the School of Social Work. Not every state has a social work school where the students are imbued with this ethic of advocacy. I spent some time in Maryland, and we actually had to pay the state social work school to train people for child protection and foster care because their main mission, Dr. Hong, was to prepare them to hang out their shingle on a fee-for-service basis. So this St. Thomas school is a gift to our community, and we thank you for that. And also, although he's missing with us today, I want to thank Jeff Monpettit. We'll hear from him again about his insights into how litigation can be a tool for justice and give the system some financial incentives to improve. So recently, I want to say that I had the occasion to review the last 50 years of child welfare practice in this country for an article I'm writing, and I was reminded again that the philosophy of child welfare, meaning child protection and foster care, has increasingly moved away from its core mission, which is child safety and well-being, and has moved towards what practitioners like to call family-friendly practices. This started in the 1970s and has eventually culminated in a program known today in Minnesota as Family Assessment. And this has now become the main child protection program, with over 60% of families being assigned to it. And this trend also led to an overall philosophy of family preservation, which means to keep children with their biological families for as long as possible and return them from foster care as soon as possible. So over time, this family-friendly approach became increasingly, though, just parent-friendly or parent-centered, with the kind of terrible consequences for children that you saw in Stephanie's slideshow. And let me just state from the beginning that the proponents of these practices aren't unconcerned about child safety. You know, of course they're concerned about it. They're professionals in our field. But they're committed to this particular approach because they believe it will keep children safe in their biological homes while doing a better job of engaging parents and introducing and reducing racial disparities in the system. And those are really two very important goals. But we think it's long past time to recognize that this approach simply hasn't delivered on these promises. In terms of child safety, for example, one parent-friendly practice is to interview children in the presence of the alleged perpetrators. Now, can you really think of anything more traumatizing for a child than to be asked to tell what's going on in front of a person who is hurting them? And you certainly aren't going to get the information that you're there to try to get, so you can keep the child safe. And also, let me ask you, can you imagine any scenario in which a similar practice would be acceptable if the victim were an adult? What, for example, if the women who started the Me Too movement were required to confront Harvey Weinstein personally before any action would even be considered? Or would the courageous athletes who forced USA Gymnastics to finally deal with Larry Nassar have spoken out if they were required first to go challenge him in person? Obviously, we wouldn't think these terms and conditions were very reasonable, or that you would ever find out what you needed to know from that approach. So I ask, why then is it okay to interview children in front of the person who's accused of harming them? Now, of equal concern is giving parents and other adults in the household advance notice of a child protection worker's visit. So if there's some form of abuse going on, I think we all know what's going to happen. The child is going to be told, hey, if you know what's good for you, here's what you'll say, and you'd better not tell about our little secret. So once again, you wouldn't get the information you need about the level of risk to that child. And then third is a policy to not go through a standard fact-finding protocol. How, I ask, is it possible to know whether children are safe if the caseworker doesn't ask questions? And in terms of racial equity, how is it possible to have an unbiased decision-making process unless workers are trained in the same process that is the same for everyone and can be monitored through quality reviews? Also, and Jeff's remarks that we heard a little bit about in Taken Too Soon, the Taken Too Soon video, show that family preservation also hasn't been done safely. There were 47 children who have been killed by their caregivers since we started keeping track after the governor's task force in 2015. Over 1/5 of them, by the way, were in foster or kinship foster care. But interestingly, there were no child deaths for 17 months after the task force completed its work. 17 months, because no one wanted to have the next child fatality on their caseload. And I think that shows us that we can protect children if that's a priority. But after that hiatus, child deaths have resumed at the same rate as before the task force, about 1 every 6 or 7 weeks. Now, most of these fatalities, if you read the case files, didn't just have red flags, they had flashing warning lights and sirens. Autumn Hallow, for example, whom we showed briefly, was starved to death over 7 months, pretty much under the noses of the court, child protection, and the police. Melody Vang was beaten to death by her mother practically as soon as she got back from foster care. And I think a routine risk assessment would have shown that the parents weren't ready for reunification. Our social workers have the skill to figure that out. Layla Marianne Jackson was a black toddler placed with a white supremacist relative. Now, I think his views could probably have been discovered with just an ordinary amount of due diligence before she was placed. And if you read their cases, you can see that many of these 47 children, and I think really most of them, would be alive today if we would just restore a sensible balance, just a sensible balance between the goals of child safety and family preservation. Now, another premise of family assessment is the assumption that parents will engage in child protection services voluntarily. But a recent analysis of 30 evaluations of these types of programs nationally found that the uptake of voluntary services was, in the author's words, extremely low. And that's something we found in research that we also did in Minnesota as well. You know, this isn't hard to understand. Just picture this. Knock on the door. Hi, I'm from Child Protection. Would you like services? Door is closed. That's what actually happened. And finally, in terms of reducing racial disparities, after 20 years of family assessment, Black and Indigenous families are still greatly overrepresented in the system. So parent-centered practices really haven't done much to help change that. Now, let's go in the other direction for a minute. We do have a lot of reasons to be encouraged. First, in our own work at Safe Passage, I am excited to share with you today that we have been given a contribution of $50,000 by two of our generous supporters, Kathleen Blatz and Greg Page. And this money is to hire a graduate of the St. Thomas School of Law under the Ireland Fellows Program. Our Ireland Fellow is going to analyze county fatality review reports to see what factors contributed to the 47 child murders, including how many times maltreatment reports on them were screened out and there was no service, and how many times they were diverted to family assessment instead of an investigation. So we thank Kathleen and Greg and the St. Thomas Law School for this wonderful opportunity. Another reason for optimism is that at last count, 13 states have suspended or permanently discontinued their versions of family assessment, often due to multiple child murders like those we've seen here today. We believe as more states have to start to reckon with the adverse consequences of parent-centered practices, the pressure to make changes will mount. And we've also been heartened by our recent conversations with legislators, particularly members of the Persons of Color and Indigenous or Posse Caucus, who have been sympathetic to our proposed legislation and, in a number of cases, offered to co-author it. And I think maybe most importantly, individual leaders and organizations of color are emerging now whose advocacy work is more child-focused. And I believe the campaign for a more child-centered system has to be led by these legislators and nonprofit leaders of color. They can address better than we the concern in communities of color that having tighter policies around child safety will result in removing more children from their homes. And on that issue, we suggest that there are ways to address racial disparities that aren't being fully utilized. Keep in mind that the process of child protection, the purpose of child protection, is to interrupt the abuse and make sure children are safe. It's not necessarily to remove them. You heard Becky Galboy talk about having parents and children go into foster care together as a way to do parenting skills and do it 24/7. And while making sure at the same time that children are safe. Now, the funding streams to do this program are already in place. It wouldn't require new legislation or a new appropriation, so we can just start using it. Also, particularly in neglect cases, services like early learning scholarships and various home visiting programs can provide the brain stimulation that infants and toddlers need desperately to develop normally, while at the same time supporting the parents and having an extra pair of eyes on the situation to enhance child safety. So let's promote more solutions like these to help address racial disparities and still keep children safe. So what does this all mean for future prospects? Well, as some of you know, I spent a couple of decades in state and county human services agencies where I was usually involved in some kind of major organizational change. And one thing I experienced is that progress often seems to be frustratingly slow, but when the tide turns, the change moves more quickly than you expected. Well, the tide has been going out now for children for 50 years, and the forces that keep pushing the system to be more and more parent-focused may seem to be stronger than ever. But I think all of this might easily take all it might take to easily turn the tide is to change a few of the key practices that I just described, either because of legislative pressure or court intervention or renewed media attention to child welfare. Today, managers and caseworkers in Minnesota are very committed to these parent-centered practices. But their position is not empirically sound. The research just doesn't support it. And in my case, again, in my experience, when this situation happens, people tend to recognize it. They tend to recognize their position isn't supported by the research, and when the change starts to happen, they're willing to start and try a new approach. So, if you will continue to support us in all of the many ways you have in the past, and we are very grateful for your support, we, on our hand, are committed to stay the course, and I believe that the mission of child welfare then will once again be to make child safety and well-being its top priority. So thank you very much. And I'm going to reintroduce our board chair, David Foster. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Mike Howe, for illuminating why Minnesota needs safe passage and the essential work safe passage has before us. Please help. You heard Mike Howe talk about precious lives, and that's what these children are. And so we just ask for your support, and there's really 3 ways to do this. First, spread the word. Share this event, which will be on safepassageforchildren.org. Host a virtual or in-person gathering of friends so they can learn more. 2, volunteer as a child advocate. Join us at the state capitol. As a committee member by joining our board. And 3, donate. There are 2 links in the Zoom chat box to donate. One for our General Operation Fund and the other one for our Advocates Fund, supporting our advocacy efforts at the Capitol. This is not tax deductible. You can also donate via our website, via check sent to the address in the form that you should all receive. Looks like this. And also, we do accept donations via your donor advised fund or qualifying charitable distribution from your IRA if you're over 70 and a half. And we also, of course, appreciate matching gifts from your company and especially appreciate people who become sustaining supporters with reoccurring gifts. However you choose to help, thankful Thank you for your thoughtfulness and generosity. Your gifts help the most vulnerable children, and if you can give just one child an opportunity for a better life, you too are a hero for children. Thank you.